Hi all, welcome back. In our previous tutorial, we looked at the mouse move event and built like a small drawing app inside of HTML. And we also looked at the mouse down and mouse up events, right? Which tell us when the user clicks on the mouse while holding it down, and then when the user releases the mouse. In this tutorial, we're going to look at two more mouse events, and I think that's going to wrap up our mouse event section. We're looking at mouse over and mouse out, which are sort of similar to the CSS hover, right? Like they tell us when the user started hovering on top of a certain HTML element, and then when the user got out of that element with their mouse. We're also going to look at how to do custom cursors in HTML, which is super fun. And then we'll look at CSS transitions, so kind of animating some of our CSS properties. I'm just going to show one brief example of that, and you can dig deeper if you want to. And we're also going to learn how to place elements in a circle on an HTML page. That sounds quite a lot, but all of them are kind of small things. So let's get started by just creating a div inside of the middle of our page, and we're going to give it an ID to be able to work with it from JavaScript, and we'll start from there. So I'll just say div ID equals, I'll just call it center, class equals center element, and let's style it center element. I'm going to give it a width of, let's say, 100, height of 100. I'll give it a background color of yellow, and we should start seeing it. Let's make it tiny. 100 is good. Great, and let's place it in the middle of our page. So for that, we could just do position fixed, left 50% and top 50%. And then if you remember, there was like right now, the top left corner of the square is in the center. There was the trick with using the CSS transforms in order to move the center of our div to the center of the page. So you could say transform translate x minus 50%, right? So this moves the div to the left by 50% of its width, and translate y minus 50%. Oh, there's no comma in between them. They just go one after the other, right? So right now our div is placed right in the middle of the page. Let's also style the body a little bit. Let's give it margin 0 like we did last time. Let's make it 100 viewport width wide and 100 viewport height tall. And let's give it a background color of something close to black but not quite black, so I'll say maybe 10 10 10 and 1 for opacity, right? So this is just a very dark gray. Why is that not showing up? Oh, because I misspelled background. Okay, great. Maybe we could go with 30, a slightly less dark gray. All right, cool. Great, so now what we want to do is to work with the mouse over and mouse out events to first sort of change the visual style, change the maybe background color of our element. So our element is called center, and we're going to go inside of script. We're going to start as usual with the event listener for our page having loaded. So I'll just say window add event listener DOM content loaded, and then our function. And let's see, we'll create a variable for the center element, and we'll do document get element by ID center. Is that what we called it? Yes, center. Okay, great. And now we want to add the two event listeners, mouse over and mouse out. So center element add event listener mouse over, and then create a function for it on mouse over. We'll do the same thing for mouse out, and we'll call it on mouse out, and then we need to create the two functions, right? So function on mouse over, we get an event, and then function on mouse out. and we get an event. Great, and to begin with, let's just print to the console when these two functions are getting called, just to kind of get an understanding of how this works. So console log on mouse over and console log on mouse out. Great, so pay attention to the console. Right now we're not seeing anything. The moment my cursor enters the div, we see the on mouse over event firing exactly once. The moment my cursor exits, we see on mouse out firing exactly once. All right, cool. So one simple thing we could do would be to change the background color of this div whenever we hover on top of it. And this is totally something that you could replicate, that you could build using the CSS hover property, right? However, if you want to get into more custom interactions of things happening whenever you hover over an element, we need to use JavaScript. And that's what we're going to do further down in this tutorial. To begin with, though, we can just change the background color. Remember, there's the event.target, which gives us the element that the event is related to. So we'll just say center element equals event.target. Alternatively, we could just do another get element by ID, right? So we could just do this again and get the element, and maybe I'll just keep this one for now. Right, so these two are sort of equivalent in this scenario. And let's change its background color to red when it's being hovered. Right, so I'll just say center element style for background color equals to red. Right, so right now if I hover over it, it turns into red, which is exactly what we're expecting. However, when I go out, the color remains red, right? So we need to change it back to yellow in the mouse out event. So I'll just copy the code from on mouse over into on mouse out, right? So we're getting the element, and we just want to change its background color to yellow. Right, so when we enter, we get a red, and when we exit, we get a yellow. All right, that's it for now for changing the background color of this element. One other fun thing we could do to this is to change our cursor into something custom whenever we're hovering over this element. And it's really easy to do, it turns out. We just need to go into CSS and use the cursor CSS property. We've used the cursor CSS property before when we wanted to turn the cursor into a pointer whenever hovering on top of a link. It's the same property, but you can use it with images as well, not just with predefined HTML cursors. So I'm just going to use this class, the center element, and I'll say, oops, oh no, never mind, sorry. This is what we wrote before. I thought it was there from before. Right, so instead of center element, we're going to say cursor, and let's start with the predefined HTML one, right? So if we say cursor pointer, we see our cursor turning into the pointer one as we hover over. However, if we want to use an image, I have over here a small image of a pizza, and we can turn our cursor into a slice of pizza. I'm going to copy this URL, right? So you need the URL of an image, and this image needs to be, I think, smaller than 64 by 64 pixels in order for the browser to want to take it as a cursor. If it's larger, it's just not going to work. It might be 128 instead of 64, I can't remember exactly, but it's pretty small. So I'm just going to say cursor and then replace the pointer with the following syntax. We have to say URL, open and close parentheses, and then just paste our URL inside. And then we also need to give it a fallback, just in case the image is not working for any reason. The page needs to be able to display a cursor, and for that I'm just going to say default. Right, so this is the first cursor in terms of priority, which is the image of our pizza. If that doesn't work, it's just going to be the default one. So now when we hover over our square, our cursor becomes a slice of pizza, which is amazing. Um, if you look online for custom cursors, you should be able to find huge libraries of various images that you could use for your cursors. You can also just draw your own, right, and upload it to Imager or another image hosting website and get the link from there. You can also upload it to Glitch into your assets folder and get the link from there, right? There's many ways for you to create a custom cursor. All right, cool. So the next thing we're going to do, I want us to start adding start adding elements around this square, kind of in a circle, every time we hover into it, right? So like when we hover once, an element should appear at the top. When we hover again, another one should appear to the right of it, kind of like a clock that fills out around our square every time we hover over. And the way to do that is the following. Let's get started by just adding one element at the very top when we hover. Right, so we have on mouse over, we're gonna add some more stuff here. We want to create a new element and yeah, get started with that. So we'll just say var new element equals document create element. I'm just going to create divs. We can style it a little bit. We can say new element style with, let's say, 10 pixels. Same for height. I'll give it a background color. Let's say blue. And we need to give it a position, right? And as we know, this div is in the center of our screen. And if we wanted to add something right above it, what we could do is get the center of our screen by using the window inner width and inner height that we used in the previous tutorial, right? So if we said var center x equals window inner width over 2, right? So that's half of the window width, which happens to be the center. And then same thing, center y, window inner height over 2. Right, so that would place something in, or like these are the coordinates of the center. If we added this element to the center, and maybe we'll begin with that, we should see it showing up on top of our div. So we just need to say new element style position. We're just gonna make it fixed for simplicity, and then style left is going to be equal to center x, right? So this is very similar to what we did in the previous tutorial. And then right is going to be not right. Top is going to be equal to center y, and then we shouldn't forget to add it to our HTML. So we can just say document.body dot append child new element. All right, great. So now when we hover on top of our square, we see it showing up in the top left corner of the body, which is not good. That means our positioning didn't work. And indeed it didn't work because we forgot to add the pixels unit of measurement for the left and top. We also forgot to convert these two from floats to integers, right? Like if the window inner width is an odd number, it is like 349, half of it is going to be float, and CSS doesn't like that. So we need to do the math.round again. Math.round. Right, so now it shows up sort of in the center of our square. It's the same issue that we had before, where the top left corner of our tiny square is placed in the center of our square. So we're going to fix that. However, notice that when we transition from our large square into our small one, the mouse out event gets called, right? So keep that in mind. If you have multiple elements on top of each other, mouse out gets called when you go inside of an inner one. So let's do the transform as well. new element style transform equals, and then we'll just say the same thing as in CSS, translate x for -50% and translate y for -50%. So now it should be in the dead center of our div, which is great. All right, cool. So now every time we hover over, a new div gets created, right? So if we inspect the element, we should see many divs. They're all blue squares, but they're on top of each other, so we only see one, right? But what we were saying is that we want to have them go sort of around this large one in a circle. And in order to do that, we should first talk a little bit about how a circle works. And if you might remember this from math, from trigonometry, in that sine and cosine are actually really important in creating things on a circle. So I'm just going to write some stuff in the comments section here. If like a circle, placing a point on a circle has to do with a few parameters. First, there is the center of the circle, right? The position of the center of the circle, which in our case is going to be the center of the page. It's going to be where our small blue square is. The second parameter is the radius of the circle, right? Like, do we want the radius to be kind of the size of the square? Do we want to be larger, right? And that's going to tell us how spread apart the points are going to be on the circle, right? So center, radius, and the third parameter is the angle that we want to place the points on the circle, right? So is it at the very top? Is it to the right? Is it to the bottom, right? Like, it's just the angle between the point and where, between the center and where on the circle we want to be drawing our point, right? So there's the center, there's the radius, and there's the angle. And in our case, the center is fixed, right? The center is the middle of the page. The radius will also make it fixed. We'll make it, I don't know, maybe 100 or 200 pixels, make them be somewhere around here, maybe like twice the size of the square. And then the angle is what's going to be changing at every hover, right? We want to increase the angle every time we hover. First time we want to place an element maybe at the very top. The next time we hover, we want it to go a little bit further down and then a little bit further down, right? So just increasing the angle over time. In order to place a point on a circle with these parameters, it's something like this. The x of the point is going to be equal to the x of the center plus the cosine of the angle that we want multiplied by the radius of the circle. This is just math. Maybe you remember the unit circle, where a point on the circle is just that the cosine of angle and the sine of angle, right? The cosine is the x and the sine is the y. Multiplying by the radius just turns the unit circle into a larger circle, right? That gives our radius. And adding the center x moves our circle from the origin of the coordinate system to the place where we want it to be. And then the formula for the y is very similar. It's center dot y plus the sine of the angle, and then again multiplied by the radius. Why is it sine and cosine? I have no idea. I don't understand math. I'm really bad at it, but I know that this is how we can create a circle. Okay, great. So let us begin by having all of these parameters static, and then we'll get to the point where we kind of change the angle every time. So we'll just say var center. Actually, we already have the center, right? We have center x and center y, so we don't even need to worry about that. We'll create a radius, and I'll just give it 200 for now. And then I'll create an angle. And to begin with, we'll place it at 0. In this formula, at least in JavaScript, or like the way cosine and sine work in JavaScript, is with radians, not with degrees. So we're going from 0 to 2 pi instead of 0 to 360 degrees. Okay, so Let's see, let's create the position of our element based on our formula. So we'll say var element x equals to center x plus math dot cosine of angle times radius, and element y equals center y plus math dot sine of our angle times radius again. And we want to place the element at these coordinates instead of the center, right? So it's going to be element x and element y. So now whenever we hover, oh, I probably made a mistake. Oh yeah, we forgot to turn them into integer numbers, so I'm just going to say math.round for these formulas. Math.round. Okay, let's see if that changed anything. Still not showing up. Let's make the radius a little bit smaller. Let's make it maybe 100. I'm wondering maybe 200 is too large for our page. And there we go. Our element is showing up with a radius of 100. I think 200 was getting out of the screen. So if we change the angle, right? If we change the angle to let's say math.pi, so this is 180 degrees, it should show up on the left side of the square. All right, if we change it to math.pi over 2, which is 90 degrees, it should show on the bottom, right? If we make it 2 times math.pi, which is 360 degrees, it should show up on the right side, which is equal to 0. All right, so let's actually make the square a little bit bigger. Let's make it 20 pixels just so we see it better. And let's start creating the interaction where every time the user hovers, we kind of change the angle and make the circle fill out around our square. And that, it turns out that's really simple to do. We just need to turn angle into a global variable, and every time the user hovers over our square, we need to increase that angle by a little bit, right? So in that case, the circle is just going to keep filling out based on the new angles. So I'm actually going to comment out this part. I'm going to turn angle into a global variable, and we'll start with 0. And then every time we do on mouse over, I'll just say angle equals angle plus, and we can add maybe 15 degrees every time. That would be, oh man, math.pi over, I need a calculator for that. 180 is math.pi over 15, 12. Okay, so math.pi over 12. Right, so if we keep increasing this angle, the new squares are going to show up on a circle around our large square. So that's number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, 5. Right, so every time we hover, a new one appears on a circle around the original one. Right, and now they kind of refill the same circle. We could do another thing where every time we've made a complete circle, we increase the radius. So we start a new circle. In order to do that, we could also turn radius into a variable. So we can say var radius equals, and we'll start with 100. Right, so now it's a global variable. The behavior should be exactly the same as before. Nothing new under the sun. And the way to check that the circle has completed is that the angle would be a multiple of 2 pi, right? So 2 pi is a full circle. Whenever the angle hits 2 pi, 4 pi, 6 pi, we have a full circle. And one way to easily kind of keep track of that, we could just say, if the angle is larger than or equal to 2 pi, we just subtract 2 pi from it. So the moment it gets to 2 pi, to 360 degrees, we bring it back to 0 because they're equivalent, right? So it kind of goes up and then back to 0, and then up and then back to 0. And then to check that a full circle has completed, the angle needs to be equal to 0. So we'll just say if angle is larger than or equal to 2 times math.pi, we can just say angle equals angle minus 2 times math.pi. And then we can say if angle is equal to 0, I'm just going to remove this comment. Right, so this means a full circle has completed. We can increase the radius. So we can just say radius equals radius plus, let's say 25 for now, and see what happens. All right, so let's see how this works, right? So I keep hovering over our large circle, we get a full circle, and then nothing happened. So let's figure out why that is. Let's go into our console, and I'm going to print our angle to the console. Okay, so it's increasing, it's getting to pi. Oh, I see. So it got to pi, but it only became 0 afterwards. That might be also a precision error. So the way, I think there are a few ways we could solve that. We could check, instead of checking if it's larger than or equal to exactly 2 pi, we could add like a small rounding error, like a 0.0000001, and then check if it's within that range from 0. Let me think if there's any other better solution than that. So let's print the angle and then also 2 times math.pi to see if it's actually that. And I'm actually going to make the angle pi over 4 so we don't have to hover over that many times. Okay, so now it increased the radius. Right, so I think it was a precision issue earlier on. And I think the way we could fix that could be something like, instead of asking if it's larger than or equal to 2 times math.pi, we could say if the difference between angle and 2 times pi, and take the absolute value of that, right? So like if it's absolute value means if it's a -1, the absolute value of that is 1, like the modulo, and say if that's lower than 0.001, like the precision, then we remove 2 pi from it. And then instead of asking if angle is 0, again we can ask if the absolute value of angle minus 0.001 if the absolute value of angle is smaller than or equal to 0.0001. Let's just do 2 zeros. Right, so we're, instead of checking equal numbers, we're checking with a little bit of a precision. This is something that often needs to be done when you program with float numbers, because the computer can have precision errors. So let's try it again. It was working earlier in this context with pi over 4. Let's see if it works also with pi over 12 like we had it earlier. Yep. Yeah, so it was the precision issue, right? So like every time we hover over over our center square, we keep getting larger and larger and larger circles around it. And that's how you can place elements on a circle. And the final thing that I would like to do for this is to create a hover CSS property for each one of these squares and animate their opacity, right? So every time the user hovers, they should become a little transparent in an animated way, and then come back to being fully opaque. And in order to do that, we could create a class, a CSS class for each one of them, and place the opacity attribute inside of that class. So whenever we create the new element, we could also give it a class. So we can say new element dot set attribute class, and then we can just say opacity hover. And then in style.css, we can say opacity hover and give it an opacity of 1. And then we also need to implement the hover interaction for that, right? So we would say opacity hover, and then the hover selector, and this would give them an opacity of, let's say, 0.2. Let's see if this works. Right, so we create one, and oh, I forgot to add the dot in the CSS. Let's try again. Yep, so whenever we hover over the element, it becomes almost fully transparent, right? But there's no animation quite yet. This happens for every element, right? And in order to animate a CSS property, we can use the transition property. And transition works like this. First, you need to tell CSS what property you want to animate. In our case, it's opacity. Second, we need to give it the duration of the transition, right? So like, does it take 1 second to go from opacity 1 to 0.2? Does it take 0.1 seconds? Does it take like a minute, or how long does it take? In our case, let's make it 5 seconds. And then you need to give it an easing function. An easing function means how is this transition happening over time? If it's linear, it's just going straight from 1 to 0.2. There's all these other kinds of functions that kind of simulate real world phenomena through the way they're working. In our case, let's just make it linear. Right, so the way it works is that whenever we hover, it's going to slowly, over the course of 5 seconds, become opaque. And then when we get out, again, slowly over the course of 5 seconds, it's going to turn back to fully opaque. All right, so now if we create a bunch of them and then go around the circle, changing their opacity, we should kind of see a right, like they're slowly becoming opaque, slowly becoming more transparent and then more opaque. Let's change this actually to like 0.5 seconds so we can go around quicker and maybe see an effect, like a trailing effect of things happening. Yep. And another quick note on the transition. Transition can be applied to pretty much any CSS property that is a number, right? So if you wanted to make transitions for the left or for the top, which are numbers, for the width and for the height, those are always on the table. If you wanted to make transitions for position, for example, that doesn't really work, right? Because there's no way to transition from position fixed to position absolute in a smooth way. So that just wouldn't do anything. All right, I think I'm going to stop here. Sorry for the bugs earlier around the precision. Let me know if anything wasn't clear, if anything didn't make sense. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Thank you.